The glass doors of the Arrow Ridge Tower slid open at precisely 7:48 a.m., and Victoria Vance stepped into the high-frequency world of Vance Strategic Holdings like an unyielding verdict. Her charcoal gray tailored suit was flawless, her dark hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed structurally engineered. 44 floors above downtown Seattle, her kingdom operated in absolute expensive silence. It was a culture where performance was measured in decimals and vulnerability was considered a design flaw. Her executive assistant, Nicole Keller, fell into step beside her immediately, holding a tablet and a steaming porcelain cup. The third quarter infrastructure review begins at 9 a.m. sharp in the Horizon boardroom, Nicole murmured, her voice clipped. The external auditors from Apex Capital are already inside. Everyone is seated. Is the technical liaison present? Victoria asked, her voice cool, level, and entirely devoid of morning warmth. Nicole hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers hovering over the glass screen. Not yet, Miss Vance. Garrett Cross hasn't badged through the security turnstiles. We've tried his radio and his personal line. No response. Victoria stopped moving, turning her gaze slowly toward her assistant. The silence that followed was heavy enough to make the nearby trading floor feel distant. Garrett Cross had been the lead systems engineer for 27 months. His file showed an immaculate record of early arrivals, a quiet man who kept the skyscraper's massive climate, electrical, and structural systems functioning without ever demanding a spotlight. But to Victoria Vance, past reliability was not a shield against present failure. In this building, time is respect, Victoria said, her words dropping like ice cubes into a glass. When someone is late, they are telling me that their schedule matters more than the survival of this firm. I do not tolerate arrogance from the basement layers. If he is not in that chair by 9, find a replacement and have HR prepare his severance. By 2 a.m., the boardroom was suffocatingly quiet. 14 senior executives and outside investors sat around the Indonesian mahogany table, their eyes darting toward the empty leather chair at the foot of the layout. Victoria conducted the meeting with surgical precision, bypassing the missing technical data seamlessly, her face a mask of absolute control. She didn't raise her voice, but the tension in the room was thick enough to choke. At exactly 9:36 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. Every eye shifted. Garrett Cross stood in the threshold. He wore his standard dark navy technician uniform, but the garment was fundamentally transformed. The left shoulder seam was violently torn, exposing a dark bruise blooming beneath his skin. A sharp line of dried blood cut across his temple, and his right hand was wrapped tightly in a grease-stained shop towel. He was breathing heavily, his jaw locked in a tight, stoic line as he tried to stabilize his posture under the collective glare of the company's elite. Mr. Cross, Victoria said, not looking up from her tablet immediately. She capped her fountain pen with a deliberate metallic click. You are 46 minutes late for the most critical infrastructure audit of the fiscal year. I know, Miss Vance, Garrett said. His voice wasn't shaking. It was deep, rough around the edges, and carried a strange, grounded weight that didn't belong in a room full of spreadsheets. I apologize to the board for the disruption. Victoria stood up, leaning her hands on the polished wood. She looked at his torn uniform, the blood on his temple, and the dirt scuffed across his heavy work boots. In her mind, this wasn't the appearance of a dedicated worker. It was the look of a man who had been careless, who had allowed his personal chaos to bleed into her tightly calibrated machine. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer him the dignity of an explanation. To her, reasons were just softly wrapped excuses. Your position requires absolute dependability, Mr. Cross, Victoria stated, her gaze cutting through him like glass. We do not run a charity, nor do we adjust our operational clocks for individual negligence. You are terminated from Vance Strategic Holdings, effective immediately. Leave your security badge with Nicole. The room held its collective breath. An investor shifted uncomfortably. A junior VP lowered his head. It was a brutal public execution of a career, meant to reinforce the absolute authority of the woman at the head of the table. Garrett Cross didn't flinch. He didn't beg, he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't utter a single syllable about the dark alleyways 3 blocks away or the screaming child he had just saved. He simply looked Victoria Vance dead in the eyes with a calm, penetrating strength that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Understood, Miss Vance, Garrett said quietly. He unclipped his heavy titanium security badge, placed it silently on the edge of the mahogany table, turned on his heel, and walked out, closing the door behind him without making a sound. 10 minutes later, Garrett stood in the concrete basement locker room, the smell of industrial oil and old iron surrounding him. He opened locker 42. Inside sat a worn canvas backpack in a single, small silver frame. The photograph showed a 7-year-old girl with bright, fierce eyes and a gap-toothed smile, holding a plastic dinosaur. Maya, his entire universe. Elena Diaz, the senior electrical tech, burst through the heavy metal door, her face flushed with anger. Garrett, tell me she didn't just fire you. I saw Nicole pulling your file. It's done, Elena, Garrett said, gently placing the photograph of his daughter into the center of his backpack. Are you insane? Elena stepped closer, pointing at the dried blood on his temple. You look like you fought your way through a war zone. Tell her what you did on the way here. Tell her why you were actually late. Garrett zipped the bag with a steady, rhythmic pull. She didn't ask, Elena. And a place that requires you to plead for your humanity isn't a place where I can afford to waste my time. I have to get home to Maya. He slung the pack over his uninjured shoulder and walked toward the concrete stairs, his boots echoing in the emptiness. Upstairs on the 44th floor, Victoria Vance sat back at her desk, her mind already moving to the next quarterly projection. But the image of Garrett's steady, unblinking eyes kept fracturing her focus. Suddenly, her personal cell phone shattered the silence, vibrating violently against the glass desktop. The caller ID read, St. Jude Leadership Academy, her 8-year-old daughter, Chloe's school. Victoria snatched the phone, a cold spike of adrenaline hitting her veins. Victoria Vance. Ms. Vance? A frantic, trembling voice came through the line, followed immediately by the sound of a child sobbing hysterically in the background. This is Principal Thorne. There's been an attempted abduction just outside the campus perimeter. Chloe is safe, but she's completely traumatized. She's refusing to speak to the police. She's just screaming for you and for the man who saved her life. Victoria's heart stopped. The absolute control she prided herself on dissolved into pure, visceral terror. Chloe? What happened? Who saved her? The principal took a shaky breath. We don't know his full identity, Miss Vance. He didn't wait for the ambulance. But your daughter keeps repeating his name. She says he works for you. His name is Garrett Cross. Victoria dropped the porcelain coffee cup. It shattered on the floor of her executive suite, dark liquid pooling around the pointed tips of her designer heels, but she didn't even look down. The woman who had dismantled multi-million-dollar corporations without a blink was suddenly trembling, her breath catching sharply in her throat. She dashed out of her office, past a stunned Nicole, and ran straight for the executive elevator, completely ignoring the whispered gasps of her staff. For the first time in 4 years, Victoria Vance was not calculating an outcome. She was living in pure, unadulterated terror. The drive to St. Jude Leadership Academy took 12 agonizing minutes through the dense Seattle traffic. Victoria threw open the heavy oak doors of the school's private infirmary, her immaculate corporate composure completely shattered. Inside, 8-year-old Chloe was curled into a tight ball on a small leather cot, her small shoulders shaking with silent, exhausted sobs. A school nurse and a uniformed cop, Officer Thomas Briggs, were standing near the window, looking completely helpless. The moment Chloe saw her mother, she didn't rush forward with relief. Instead, she reached out her trembling hands, her eyes wide, with a lingering, visceral horror. "Mommy!" Chloe choked out, her voice raw and cracked from crying. A bad man. He grabbed my jacket by the stone gate. He tried to pull me into a dark van. I screamed for help, but the engine was too loud. Victoria pulled her daughter into her arms, burying her face in Chloe's hair, feeling a violent wave of nausea wash over her. "It's okay, baby. I'm here. You're safe now." "No, you don't understand," Chloe whispered, pulling back slightly to look into Victoria's eyes with absolute intensity. "The bad man was big. But then, the quiet man from your office appeared. The one who helped fix the lights in our lobby last month. He didn't even hesitate, Mommy. He ran right between us. The bad man hit him with something heavy, a metal bar. I heard it hit his chest. I heard something crack inside him." Victoria felt the blood completely drain from her face. 3 cracked ribs. That was what Garrett had told the nurse at the urgent care clinic. He hadn't been in a reckless street brawl. He had taken a steel pipe to the chest to shield her daughter from a kidnapper. "But he didn't fall down," Chloe continued, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "He stayed right there. He used his own back to block the van door so the man couldn't pull me inside. He kept his left arm around me, squeezing my hand. and he looked right at me and said, "Don't look at him, Chloe. Look at me. You're completely safe with me." His voice was so quiet and steady. Mommy. He wasn't scared at all. Even when he was bleeding, he just made me feel so warm. Officer Briggs stepped forward, his expression deeply grim. "Miss Vance, your daughter is telling the exact truth." The suspect was armed and highly aggressive. If your technician hadn't intervened with that kind of advanced defensive positioning, the kidnapper would have succeeded. The man is a trained professional. We need to find him immediately to get a full description of the suspect and frankly to ensure he's properly taken care of for those injuries. Chloe gripped Victoria's charcoal blazer tightly, her small fingers digging into the expensive fabric. "Mommy, when the teachers finally ran out into the courtyard, he didn't wait for the ambulance. I asked him why he was leaving when his face was bleeding. He wiped the blood away and told me, 'I have to go, little bird. If I'm late for my meeting, your mom will be disappointed, and I can't afford to lose this job. My daughter is counting on me.'" Every single word felt like a physical blow to Victoria's chest. She remembered the cold, arrogant way she had dismissed him in front of the entire board. She remembered telling him that his lateness proved he didn't respect the firm. She had publicly executed the career of a man who had literally spilled his blood to keep her universe from collapsing. A man who had walked into her boardroom in agonizing pain just to keep his promise to his own child. Victoria stood up, her knees shaking beneath her tailored skirt. She stepped into the quiet hallway of the school and dialed her assistant with trembling fingers. "Nicole, listen to me," Victoria commanded, her voice cracking with an emotion her staff had never heard before. "Cancel the termination. Rehire Garrett Cross immediately. Give him whatever salary he asks for. Triple his benefits. Find out where his daughter goes to school. Send an executive car to bring him to my office right now. I don't care what it takes. Find him." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Victoria could hear the frantic clicking of a keyboard, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Miss Vance." Nicole's voice was laced with a sudden, deep panic. "We have a massive problem." "What do you mean?" Victoria snapped, her corporate dominance flaring through her lingering terror. "Just look up his home address in the employee database and send a courier." "I'm trying, miss." "Vance," Nicole whispered, her voice shaking. But the moment I flagged his profile to reverse the termination, the HR software locked down. The entire system just went completely red. A global security alert from the Department of Defense just overrode our entire corporate server. His physical address, his past employment, his banking routing numbers, everything has been entirely wiped and replaced with a black federal warning screen. It says that attempting to trace the background of Garrett Cross is a direct violation of the National Security Act. Miss Vance, who exactly did we just fire? The executive elevator dropped like a stone, the digital floor indicator rapidly counting down until it reached the concrete basement level. When the door slid open, Victoria Vance stepped out into a world she had intentionally ignored for 4 years. The air down here was thick, smelling of heavy machinery, heated coolant, and old iron. The pristine, white-carpeted luxury of the 44th floor felt a million miles away. She found Elena Diaz in the auxiliary generator room, throwing heavy titanium wrenches into a metal tool chest with violent, rhythmic thuds. "Miss Vance," Elena said, not turning around, her voice dripping with undisguised contempt. "Come down here to make sure I pack his locker correctly? Don't worry, I won't steal any of your precious corporate copper." "Elena, look at me," Victoria said, her voice dropping its usual executive edge, replaced by an urgent, raw tone. "I need to know who Garrett Cross really is. The Department of Defense just placed a level 5 security lock on his employee file. The federal government just wiped our HR servers to protect his identity. What is he hiding?" Elena stopped. She let a heavy socket wrench drop into the bin with a loud clang, then turned around slowly, wiping grease from her palms onto a stained rag. Her eyes were hard, piercing right through Victoria's expensive facade. "You think money buys you the right to know everything, don't you?" Elena asked bitterly. "You see a man in a Navy uniform and you think he's just a line item on your balance sheet. I don't know a damn thing about his military records, Miss Vance. He never talked about the past. But I'll tell you who he is down here." Elena marched over to locker 42 and ripped the metal door wide open. It was completely empty, save for a single piece of paper taped to the back of the steel wall. "He's a man who works 12-hour shifts so his daughter can go to a school with a perimeter wall," Elena said, her voice cracking slightly as she pointed at the paper. He's a man who hasn't bought himself a new pair of work boots in 3 years because his kid needed specialized physical therapy after the accident that took his wife. Look at that, Miss Vance. That's who Garrett Cross is. Victoria stepped forward, her throat tightening. Taped to the steel was a colorful child's drawing. It depicted a tall man in a technician's uniform holding a little girl's hand under a giant, brilliant yellow sun. At the bottom, written in uneven, vibrant crayon, were the words, "My daddy protects the whole world." Victoria reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the edge of the paper. The contrast between her ruthless corporate efficiency and this raw, unprotected love hit her like a physical blow. She had looked at an empty chair in a boardroom and seen a personal insult to her authority, completely blind to the quiet hero who was holding his fractured universe together with nothing but sheer willpower. Suddenly, the heavy security radio clipped to Victoria's waist flared to life with static, shattering the basement's damp silence. "Miss Vance, do you copy?" It was Chief Mitchell Hayes from the ground floor security desk, his voice laced with a sudden, anxious panic. "We have a critical situation in the main lobby. There's a child here, a little girl." Victoria snatched the radio, her thumb pressing the talk button instantly. "Hayes, report. Is it Chloe? Is she okay?" "No, ma'am." "It's not Miss Chloe," Hayes replied, his voice dropping to a tense whisper. "The girl says her name is Maya Cross. She's 7 years old. She says her dad was supposed to pick her up from the public library van down the street 20 minutes ago, but his phone is completely dead. She walked into the tower completely alone, and she's refusing to leave until she sees him. She's crying, Miss Vance." Victoria didn't say another word. She sprinted back to the elevator, leaving Elena standing by the open locker. When the lift doors opened into the grand white marble lobby of the Arrow Ridge Tower, the scene stopped Victoria dead in her tracks. Maya Cross was sitting on a massive, expensive black leather bench, her small legs dangling high above the polished floor. She looked impossibly tiny against the towering glass architecture of the skyscraper. She was clutching a faded plush backpack tightly against her chest, her dark eyes filled with a fierce, anxious intelligence, tears leaving clean streaks through the dust on her cheeks. The security guards were standing 5 feet back, looking completely helpless, terrified of upsetting the child of the man whose file had just triggered a federal blackout. Victoria approached slowly. For the first time in her career, she didn't care about her clothes or her posture. She dropped straight down to her knees on the cold marble floor directly in front of the little girl, bringing herself down to eye level. "Are you Maya?" Victoria asked, her voice uncharacteristically soft, completely devoid of the icy command she used to rule her company. The little girl sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve, looking at Victoria with a defensive braveness that she had clearly inherited from her father. "Yes. Is my daddy still working? He's never late. He promised he'd meet me at the library corner by 4. Did he get stuck in the big cooling engines again? His phone went straight to voicemail. And he always answers for me. Always." Victoria looked into the child's eyes and felt a profound, aching wave of guilt. She hadn't just fired an employee. She had shattered the fragile sanctuary of a little girl who believed her father was invincible. She had taken away the livelihood of the man who gave this child absolute safety. "Maya, sweetie," Victoria began, her voice trembling as she reached out, gently placing her hand near the girl's small hand. "Your dad. He had to leave the building for a little while. But he is the bravest man I have ever met. He." Before Victoria could finish her sentence, a loud, heavy screech of tires echoed from the plaza outside. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors of the lobby, Victoria saw a sleek, unmarked black Suburban slam to a halt at the curb. The doors flew open, and 2 men in sharp, tailored, dark suits wearing heavy tactical earpieces stepped onto the concrete. They didn't look like local police, and they didn't look like corporate security. Their movements were cold, lethal, and perfectly synchronized. The lead agent scanned the lobby through the glass, his eyes locking directly onto Maya. He reached into his jacket, his hand resting on something concealed, and began marching rapidly toward the glass entrance. The glass entrance doors slid open with a sharp, heavy hiss, allowing a gust of cold, damp Seattle air to sweep across the pristine marble lobby. The 2 men moved with a terrifying, calculated rhythm. They wore dark, tailored overcoats that did not completely conceal the tactical harnesses beneath them, and their eyes remained fixed on Maya with predatory focus. Victoria Vance stood up slowly, her knees locking as she forced her corporate authority to the surface. She stepped directly between the approaching men and the trembling 7-year-old girl, her charcoal blazer serving as a frail barrier. "Stop right there," Victoria commanded, her voice ringing out across the vast, empty lobby. "This is private property. You are in the headquarters of Vance Strategic Holdings, and you have no authorization to be here. Chief Hayes, call the police." The lead man didn't stop. He reached into his coat, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a heavy leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold and black credential that bore no standard law enforcement markings. It was stamped with a stark, deep red seal from the Defense Intelligence Agency. "Miss Vance," the man said, his voice entirely flat, devoid of any human inflection. "I am Special Agent Arthur Kincaid. We are not here for your company, and we do not answer to the local police. Step away from the child immediately. She is a Tier 1 federal protective asset, and her location has been compromised." Victoria felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. Her mind, usually a hyper-efficient machine capable of analyzing complex financial risks in seconds, completely stalled. "What are you talking about? She's the daughter of one of my technicians." Agent Kincaid didn't look at Victoria. He signaled to his partner, who immediately moved toward the security desk, completely ignoring Chief Hayes, and began typing commands directly into the building's central mainframe. "Your technician doesn't exist, Miss Vance," Kincaid said, his eyes scanning the upper mezzanine with lethal alertness. "Garrett Cross is a phantom name generated by a joint task force relocation program 3 years ago. The man you employed to fix your air conditioning is the former chief tactical medic and extraction specialist for the most elite covert operations unit in the United States military. And right now, a highly trained foreign syndicate is hunting him." Victoria's breath hitched. She turned her head slightly, looking back at Maya, who had curled her small body into a tight knot on the leather bench, her hands pressed over her ears as she sobbed silently. Kincaid stepped closer, his boots clicking like metronome beats on the marble. "We intercepted a localized encrypted transmission 4 minutes ago. The hit team that attempted to abduct your daughter Chloe at St. Jude Leadership Academy this morning. They weren't targeting your family, Miss Vance. They didn't even know who you were." Victoria felt the entire lobby tilt beneath her feet. The air suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. "What did you just say?" "They were hunting Maya." Kincaid delivered the truth like a bullet. "The surveillance footage from the school perimeter shows the scouts were tracking the public library, Van Route. Your daughter Chloe happened to be wearing the exact same Navy and Red Academy windbreaker as Maya Cross today. She was grabbed from behind because of a visual misidentification. Your child was almost taken because she looked like his." The realization hit Victoria with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back a step, her hand flying to her mouth. She had publicly humiliated Garrett, stripped him of his livelihood, and condemned him for being late, entirely blind to the fact that her own daughter was currently alive and safe only because Garrett had thrown his own body into a war meant for his own blood. He had saved Chloe from a horror that belonged to his own universe. Maya let out a sharp, terrified cry, her small backpack falling to the floor, spilling a box of crayons across the white stone. Victoria turned, her maternal instincts overriding her corporate armor. She rushed to the bench, wrapping her arms around Maya, trying desperately to pull the little girl against her chest. But as Victoria held her, she realized she was completely helpless. Her hands were shaking violently. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She was a woman who controlled billions of dollars, a woman who commanded respect in every boardroom in the country. But in the presence of raw, visceral danger, she was entirely powerless. She couldn't stop the child's shaking because she couldn't stop her own, her money, her tower, her elite status. It was all a useless illusion. "It's okay, Maya." "It's okay," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking, tears finally spilling over her own eyelids. But the words felt hollow, stripped of any real safety. Agent Kincaid reached down, his heavy hand gripping the strap of Maya's backpack. "We are moving her to a secure holding facility in Fort Lewis. We have a transport vehicle waiting outside. Move aside, Miss Vance." "No." Maya screamed, kicking her legs, clinging desperately to Victoria's blazer. "I want my daddy. Daddy, help me! Let go of her!" Victoria flared, turning on Kincaid with a desperate, panicked fury, her nails digging into his sleeve. "You can't just take her!" Kincaid didn't flinch. He began to forcefully but cleanly lift Maya from the bench. Suddenly, The heavy glass revolving doors at the front of the tower didn't just open, they shattered. A massive, terrifying shadow cut through the light of the plaza. Garrett Cross stepped into the lobby. The humble, quiet technician who had stood submissively at the foot of the boardroom table was gone. He was still wearing his torn Navy uniform, his ribs tightly bound beneath the fabric, the dried blood still dark on his temple. But his posture was entirely transformed. He stood with a terrifying, absolute stillness, his jaw locked, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light that made both federal agents freeze instantly. Kincaid's partner immediately reached inside his coat, drawing a high-caliber tactical pistol, aiming it directly at Garrett's chest. "Stand down, Commander," Kincaid shouted, his voice losing its flat tone for the first time, replaced by sharp panic. "Do not advance!" Garrett didn't stop. He walked right past the barrel of the loaded gun, as if it were a toy, his boots crushing the shattered glass on the floor. He didn't look at the weapons. He didn't look at Victoria. His eyes were fixed entirely on his crying daughter. With a single, smooth motion, he stepped between Kincaid and Maya. The moment his shadow fell over the little girl, her screaming stopped. Garrett dropped to one knee, ignoring the agonizing pain in his cracked ribs, and wrapped his large, steady hands around Maya's face. His hands weren't shaking. His breathing was perfectly deep and slow, bringing an instant, supernatural calm into the frantic space. "Look at me, little bird," Garrett whispered, his voice deep, warm, and completely steady. "I'm right here. You're entirely safe." "The noise is over," Maya sniffled, her entire body relaxing instantly against him, burying her face into his uninjured shoulder. The contrast was staggering. Victoria, with all her wealth, had given nothing but panicked friction. This man, with absolutely nothing left to his name, radiated absolute sanctuary without even trying. Garrett stood up slowly, lifting Maya with his left arm, anchoring her against his hip. He turned his body toward Agent Kincaid, his face darkening into an expression of raw, quiet masculinity that filled the entire 40-story atrium. "You brought loaded weapons into a civilian structure," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, gravelly register that made the security guards back away. "And you put your hands on my daughter. You have exactly 3 seconds to clear those weapons from this floor before I consider you an active threat and dismantle this perimeter." Kincaid's partner kept his gun raised, his knuckles turning white, but his hand was visibly trembling. "Commander Cross, we have a breach," Kincaid said, slowly raising his hands to signal his partner to lower the weapon. "The extraction cell at the King County private hangar was hit 20 minutes ago. The syndicate knows your real identity. They know exactly what you took from the sandbox when you retired. You can't protect her alone anymore." Garrett's eyes narrowed into slits of pure steel. "I don't need your cell, Kincaid. I built the security protocols for this entire city." He turned his gaze slowly toward Victoria Vance, who was still kneeling on the floor, looking up at him with wide, awe-stricken eyes, completely stripped of her arrogance. "Miss Vance," Garrett said quietly, his voice cutting through the lingering tension. "Your daughter Chloe is still in danger. The men who tried to take her aren't fleeing the city. They just realized they grabbed the wrong girl, and they are coming back to finish the job." Garrett's warning cut through the vast marble lobby like a physical blade. Before Victoria could process the terrifying weight of his words, the heavy security terminal behind the reception desk began to beep frantically. A sharp, rhythmic crimson flash illuminated the dark stone counters. Nicole's voice erupted from Victoria's personal phone, which was still clutched in her trembling hand. It wasn't the voice of an executive assistant anymore. It was the sound of a woman completely consumed by panic. Miss Vance. The police cruiser bringing Chloe back to the tower just entered the sub-level 3 executive garage, but the automated security grid just overrode our commands. The heavy steel blast doors have slammed shut, locking them inside, and all the camera feeds down there just went completely black. Victoria's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the marble floor. Her breath caught violently in her throat, her chest tightening until she couldn't breathe. Chloe. Her little girl was trapped 40 feet beneath the earth in a pitch-black concrete bunker, completely cut off from the world, with a ruthless international hit team closing in. Agent Kincaid immediately reached for his tactical radio, twisting the frequency dial, but nothing came through except a deafening, high-pitched screech of static. "They're using a localized military-grade frequency jammer," Kincaid snarled, drawing his weapon and stepping toward the reinforced stairwell door. "They've severed the building's external comms. Civilian, cellular, satellite, and police bands are entirely dead. We're completely blind. Victoria sank toward the floor, her knees refusing to support her weight. The brilliant corporate strategist who controlled a multi-billion-dollar empire was gone, replaced by a mother entirely paralyzed by terror. She stared at the elevator banks, but the digital floor indicators had gone dark. The entire infrastructure of the tower was frozen. Garrett Cross didn't panic. While the federal agents scurried and Victoria suffocated in her fear, he remained an unyielding pillar of absolute, grounded stillness. He looked down at Maya, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. Garrett dropped to one knee, ignoring the agonizing stitch in his cracked ribs, and gently placed his large hands on his daughter's shoulders. "Maya, look at my eyes," Garrett said. His voice was a low, warm melody of absolute certainty. It didn't carry a trace of the chaos surrounding them. "I need you to stay right here on this bench with Agent Kincaid. He is going to stand right in front of you, and he is going to keep you safe. Can you do that for me, little bird?" Maya sniffled, her small fingers releasing her grip on his uniform shirt. She nodded once, her trust in him so absolute that her tears stopped falling. "Yes, Daddy. I'll stay right here." Garrett stood up smoothly and turned his gaze to Kincaid. The look in the former combat medic's eyes was so lethal, so heavy with quiet masculinity, that the veteran federal agent instinctively took a step back. "If you move from her side," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous whisper, "the syndicate will be the absolute least of your worries on this floor. Keep your weapon drawn and guard the perimeter." Kincaid didn't argue. He simply nodded, stepping into a defensive posture in front of the child's bench. Garrett turned to Victoria. She was leaning against a marble column, her hands pressed against her face, her shoulders shaking violently as she hyperventilated. "The concrete walls downstairs are 2 feet thick," she whimpered, her voice cracking with a rare, raw vulnerability. "There is no cell service. The garage doors weigh 3 tons. No one can get inside. My baby is going to die down there in the dark." Garrett walked over to her. He didn't hesitate. He reached out and placed a massive, warm hand firmly on her trembling shoulder. The physical weight of his touch seemed to instantly break through her hysteria, anchoring her back to reality. "Victoria, look at me," Garrett commanded softly. It was the very first time he had ever used her first name, stripping away the artificial corporate hierarchy that had separated them. Victoria raised her tear-stained face, her eyes locking onto his. He was bleeding from the temple, his uniform was torn, and his jaw was heavily bruised, but he looked like an immovable mountain. "Take a deep breath," Garrett said, his dark eyes radiating a supernatural calm that her wealth could never buy. "I designed the auxiliary emergency pneumatic bypasses for this entire skyscraper during my first year here. The syndicate thinks they have locked the grid, but they only studied the digital schematics. They don't know the physical bones of this building. I am going to get your daughter." Before she could answer, a heavy, mechanical groan echoed through the structural columns of the tower. The primary power grid failed. The bright, expensive lights of the lobby flickered and died, plunging the vast space into a deep, ominous amber hue as the emergency backup batteries kicked in. Upstairs, the faint sounds of shouting and distant crowd panic began to drift down from the office floors. Garrett didn't waste a single second. He marched across the lobby to a concealed maintenance access panel hidden behind a decorative tapestry. He didn't search for a key. He raised his heavy work boot and violently kicked the steel latch, ripping the door entirely off its hinges with a loud metallic screech. Inside was a network of heavy iron valves and a manual pressure lever. "The elevators are useless now," Garrett explained, his tone completely steady as he reached into the panel and pulled out a heavy tactical flashlight. "But the pneumatic ventilation shaft drops vertically right into the core of sublevel 3. It bypasses the locked blast doors entirely." He looked back at Victoria, who was staring at him in absolute awe. Her mind was reeling. This was the man she had thrown out of her boardroom like garbage. This was the man she had deemed expendable. And right now, he was the only thing standing between her child and a grave. "Follow me, and stay low," Garrett said. They sprinted through the maintenance threshold and plunged into the dark concrete stairwell. The air instantly turned freezing cold, smelling of stale dust and damp earth. As they descended rapidly past sublevel 1, a muffled, terrifying sound echoed up from the depths of the structure. Thud, thud, thud. It was followed immediately by the unmistakable, violent rattle of automatic gunfire. Victoria shrieked, her hands flying to her ears as she collapsed against the concrete wall of the landing, completely overwhelmed by the raw horror of the sound. They're shooting! Oh my God, they're shooting at her! She couldn't move. Her legs had turned to lead, her mind entirely shattered by the realization that a war zone had consumed her perfectly ordered world. Garrett stopped 3 steps below her. He didn't yell at her to hurry. He didn't lose his temper. He turned, stepped back up to her landing, and crouched directly in front of her, using his broad shoulders to completely block her view of the terrifying darkness below. He took both of her freezing, shaking hands into his massive palms, squeezing them tightly. "Victoria, listen to the cadence of the shots," Garrett said, his voice a warm, protective barrier against the terror. "It's suppressed heavy caliber, firing in short, rhythmic bursts. That means they are trying to shatter the ballistic polycarbonate glass of the police cruiser. The armored plating is holding. Chloe is safe right now, but we have exactly 2 minutes before they breach the frame. I need you to be strong for her. I need you to be my anchor right here." Victoria swallowed hard, her chest heaving as she looked into his steady face. What do you need me to do?" Garrett guided her hands toward a massive, rusted iron valve protruding from the concrete wall on the landing. "This is the manual pressure release for the main building boilers," he said. "When you hear the pneumatic pipe beside you begin to hiss, I need you to throw this valve completely to the left. It will flood the sub-level 3 ceiling with superheated emergency steam. It won't hurt Chloe inside the car, but it will completely blind the Syndicate's thermal scopes and disrupt their night vision optics." Victoria gripped the cold iron handle, her knuckles turning white. A fierce maternal desperation finally sparked behind her tears, ignited by the unyielding strength of the man standing before her. "I'll do it. I won't let go." Garrett gave her a solitary, validating nod. "Keep your head down," he whispered. He turned, clicked his flashlight off to blend into the absolute blackness, and vanished down the stairs into the abyss. Victoria stood alone in the dark, her hands locked onto the valve, her heart hammering against her ribs as the rapid gunfire below suddenly, terrifyingly, stopped. A deafening, rhythmic hiss echoed through the dark concrete stairwell as the massive pneumatic pipe beside Victoria began to vibrate violently. The metal beneath her palms grew instantly scalding hot. She remembered Garrett's words, the absolute, unwavering certainty in his voice. Gritting her teeth, she threw her entire body weight against the rusted iron valve, forcing her corporate soft hands to grind against the cold metal, turning the wheel completely to the left. Deep within the subterranean levels, a terrifying, mechanical roar erupted. Superheated emergency steam blasted from the ceiling vents of sub-level 3, instantly flooding the pitch-black concrete garage with a dense, blinding white wall of vapor. Down in the abyss, the mercenary hit team was instantly thrown into absolute chaos. The sudden, intense thermal bloom completely overloaded their military-grade night vision and infrared optics, turning their tactical scopes into blinding sheets of useless white glare. They ripped the goggles from their faces, coughing violently as the moisture-thick air destroyed their visual coordination. Garrett Cross moved through the blinding fog like a ghost born of the concrete itself. He didn't need eyes to navigate. For 27 long months, he had memorized the physical anatomy of this tower. Every structural column, every electrical conduit, every blind corner. He stepped out from the shadow of a massive pillar, his movements terrifyingly precise and entirely silent, despite the agonizing fire burning in his cracked ribs with every breath. A mercenary turned at the faint sound of a boot scraping, raising a suppressed submachine gun, but Garrett was already there. With a single explosive movement from his uninjured left arm, he clamped a hand over the weapon's barrel, redirecting the lethal frame while delivering a heavy, calculated strike to the man's sternum. The attacker dropped instantly, the breath completely stolen from his lungs. Garrett didn't linger. He glided past the falling body, his eyes fixed on the flashing red lights of the pinned police cruiser. Officer Briggs was slumped unconscious over the steering wheel, blood trickling from a hairline fracture where the ballistic glass had finally given way. In the backseat, 8-year-old Chloe was curled under the floorboards, her small hands pressed over her ears, her voice completely gone from screaming. Garrett shattered the remaining shards of the rear window with the heel of his heavy work boot. He reached his large, steady hands into the cabin and gently lifted the terrified girl into his arms. "I've got you, little bird," Garrett whispered into her hair. The sound of his voice, low, warm, and entirely unbothered by the violence surrounding them, instantly cut through Chloe's paralysis. She let out a ragged sob, wrapping her small arms around his neck like a vice. Garrett shielded her body completely with his broad torso, turning his back to the fog, and marched with long, heavy strides back toward the concrete stairwell. Up on the sub-level 1 landing, Victoria was on her knees, her hands raw and blistered from holding the iron valve. Her heart was hammering so violently she could feel it in her teeth. Suddenly, the heavy steel door flew open, and a silhouette emerged from the darkness. Garrett stepped into the light, his uniform soaked with steam and sweat, his breathing ragged, but in his arms, Chloe was breathing. "Mommy!" Chloe shrieked. Victoria let out a breathless, primal sob that ripped from the very depths of her chest. She threw herself forward, falling to the concrete floor, wrapping her arms around both of them. She buried her face in Chloe's windbreaker, her entire body shaking with a violent, beautiful relief. The ruthless, untouchable CEO of Vance Strategic Holdings was entirely gone, replaced by a mother weeping in a dirty stairwell. "Thank you. Oh my God, thank you," Victoria cried, her voice cracking as she looked up at Garrett. Garrett gave her a solitary, tired nod, carefully transferring the little girl into her mother's arms. "She's entirely unharmed, Victoria. The perimeter downstairs is neutralized. We need to get back to the lobby." The moment they pushed through the main access doors into the grand atrium, the high-intensity emergency lights suddenly snapped back to life, bathing the massive marble space in a brilliant, blinding white glare. The power grid had been forcibly restored, but the lobby was no longer the empty space they had left. The shattered glass revolving doors were pushed wide open as a column of high-ranking military officials and a black-clad, heavily armed tactical security detail from the Joint Chiefs of Staff marched into the tower. Their boots clicked in perfect, terrifying synchronization against the polished stone. At the front of the formation marched General Raymond Sterling, a man whose face was a permanent fixture on international news networks, his chest covered in legendary operational ribbons. Up on the 44th floor mezzanine, a dozen senior vice presidents and outside investors who had been hiding during the lockdown looked down over the glass railings, their faces pale with shock. Agent Kincaid immediately stepped forward, raising his credentials toward the incoming unit. "General Sterling, we have the protective asset secured on the bench. We need an immediate medical evacuation." General Sterling didn't even look at him. He brushed past the federal agent as if he were nothing but air. His hard, battle-scarred eyes locked directly onto the battered man standing in the center of the room, the man wearing a torn Navy technician uniform with dried blood on his temple. The entire 40-story atrium went completely dead silent. General Sterling halted exactly 3 paces in front of Garrett Cross. The 4-star general slowly raised his right hand to his brow, delivering a crisp, flawless, and profoundly respectful military salute to a man holding nothing but a flashlight. "Commander Cross." General Sterling's deep, booming voice echoed off the marble walls, carrying to every hidden corner of the mezzanine. "The automated security encryption keys you buried into the city's grid successfully isolated the syndicate's secondary cells. The asset network is completely secure. We received your silent distress beacon. The entire perimeter of this sector is locked down, and your primary extraction unit is standing by." Victoria stood up slowly, holding Chloe tightly against her hip. She stared at the 4-star general, then turned her gaze to her terminated employee, her mind spinning into a state of absolute, stunned bewilderment. "Commander?" General Sterling turned his hard gaze slightly toward Victoria, his voice dropping to a heavy, incredibly serious register that made every executive on the mezzanine flinch. "Miss Vance," General Sterling stated plainly, "you have spent the last 2 years running a multi-billion-dollar corporation, completely blind to the fact that the man maintaining your air conditioning was the chief architect of the United States Automated Missile Defense Grid. He is the most decorated combat extraction specialist in modern military history, and the only reason my entire division made it out of the Helmand province alive. He chose to hide in your basement at $31 an hour simply to ensure his daughter could grow up before dark." The general looked up at the quiet, stunned executive staring down from above. "And your firm threw him out like trash because he was 46 minutes late." The silence in the grand atrium of the Arrow Ridge Tower was absolute. The senior vice presidents and analysts leaning over the polished glass railings 40 floors up didn't look like masters of the universe anymore. They looked like frightened ghosts. The entire corporate structure had shrunk to a meaningless point, crushed under the massive authority of a 4-star general standing at attention before a man in a torn service uniform. Victoria Vance stood entirely frozen, her breath shallow. Her mind, usually so precise and analytical, couldn't resolve the math of the universe she was looking at. Garrett Cross. The man who had cleaned the grease filters, the man she had dismissed as a calculation error, was a military legend, and he had taken a steel pipe to the ribs because her daughter had been wearing the wrong jacket. General Sterling slowly lowered his salute, his hard face softening just a fraction as he looked at the bruising on Garrett's jaw. "Your transport is ready, Commander. We can have you at the Military Medical Center in 10 minutes. "Thank you, Raymond," Garrett said. His voice was low, devoid of any theatricality or triumph. He didn't look up at the executives who had judged him. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed the sudden reversal of power. He just looked tired. "But my daughter has had enough of federal agents for one day, and I don't need a military hospital. I just need a minute." He turned away from the general, his boots making a soft crunching sound against the shattered glass as he walked toward the bench where Maya was sitting. The moment he approached, Maya didn't care about the heavily armed tactical detail or the massive 4-star general. She threw her small arms around his waist, her face burying deep into his uniform shirt. "I stayed right here, Daddy," Maya whispered, her voice trembling but brave. "Just like you said." Garrett dropped to one knee, a sharp, ragged breath catching in his throat as the movement pulled against his cracked ribs, but his large hands remained absolutely steady as he stroked her hair. "You did perfect, little bird. The absolute best." Victoria watched them, and something behind her sternum fractured completely. She had spent 4 years building an armor of cold, light, and perfect outcome, believing that if she controlled every variable, she could protect her family from the chaos of the world. But standing here, watching this man, who had nothing but a torn uniform and an empty locker, give his child absolute safety through sheer, unshakable presence, she felt a profound, aching emptiness. Her money hadn't saved Chloe. Her status hadn't stopped the bullets. This man had given them safety without even trying. Chloe pulled at Victoria's sleeve, her small eyes fixed on Maya. "Mommy, can I talk to her?" Victoria nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She walked beside Chloe as the little girl approached the bench. Chloe stopped a few feet away, her hands tucked into the pockets of her academy windbreaker, the jacket that had started the nightmare. "Hi," Chloe said softly to Maya. "I'm Chloe." "Your dad is. He's like a superhero." Maya looked up from Garrett's shoulder, her dark eyes blinking back tears. She wiped her nose with her sleeve and sat up a little straighter. "He's just my daddy, but he fixes everything." A tiny, fragile smile broke through Chloe's pale face. "He fixed my car downstairs, and he made the bad guys go away." Garrett stood up slowly, using the back of the leather bench to support his weight. He turned to face Victoria. The silence between them now wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom. It was something rare and deeply human. Victoria looked at the blood drying on his temple, the dark bruising along his jaw, and the subtle, protective way he held his right arm against his chest. "I don't know how to say it," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a whisper that didn't carry past the two of them. Her hands were still slightly gray from the rusted iron valve, and they were trembling. She didn't look like a CEO. She looked like a woman who had been thoroughly undone by the truth. "An apology isn't enough. It's not even a fraction of what I owe you. You saved my daughter's life, Garrett. You took a weapon to the chest for her, and I threw your life away in front of everyone because of a clock." Garrett looked at her. His dark eyes had that same simple openness she had seen in the urgent care clinic, entirely unhurried, carrying no desire for revenge or humiliation. "You didn't know," Garrett said quietly. "You built a system, Victoria. In your system, people who are late are broken parts. You were just running your machine." "The machine is wrong," Victoria said fiercely, a single tear escaping her eye and cutting through the dust on her cheek. She took a step closer, her hand instinctively reaching out toward his bandaged forearm, though she stopped herself just short of touching him. The emotional chemistry between them was growing not from a forced romantic gesture, but from the raw, heavy realization that this man radiated a profound emotional security she had been starving for her entire life. "I was wrong. I looked at you and I didn't see anything but a line item. I didn't see the man holding the world together." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, the sound of the city traffic outside beginning to bleed back into the lobby as the security perimeter shifted. "I didn't choose the basement because I was hiding from the world, Victoria," Garrett said softly, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I chose it because when you're at the top, you're always looking at the horizon. You're always looking at the next threat, the next target, the next decimal point. Down there. I could just look at my daughter. I could be exactly where she needed me to be. He shifted slightly, a subtle wince crossing his features as his ribs flared with pain. Victoria's maternal instinct instantly shifted into a protective, deep concern for him. "You're in pain," she said softly, her voice filled with a rare tenderness. "Let me take care of you. Not as your boss, not as the CEO. Just let me help, please." Garrett looked at her trembling hands, then up at her face, and for the very first time, a genuine, warm smile broke through the stoic lines of his bruised face. "I think I could use a lift," he said quietly. General Sterling stepped back into the perimeter, his radio buzzing. "Commander, the local authorities have cleared the lower garage. The primary threat is fully suppressed. We need to clear the lobby before the press arrives." Victoria turned to the general, her old corporate steel returning, but this time, it was entirely redirected to protect the man standing beside her. "The press won't be coming inside this tower, General. This is private property. And Commander Cross isn't leaving through the service entrance." She turned back to Garrett, her dark eyes shining with a new, quiet determination. "My private car is in the executive courtyard. Maya, Chloe, come with us." As they walked toward the reinforced side exit, the senior vice presidents on the mezzanine watched in absolute, stunned silence. The woman who had ruled them with a ledger of cold calculation was walking side by side with a man in a torn Navy uniform, her hand subtly resting near his shoulder, her universe completely rewritten by a single hour of truth. On Monday morning, the atmosphere on the 44th floor of the Arrow Ridge Tower was fundamentally altered. There was no cold silence, nor was there the frantic, fearful clicking of keyboards that usually preceded Victoria Vance's arrival. At exactly 8 a.m., Victoria walked through the glass doors. She was still wearing a tailored suit, but her dark hair was worn down, softening the sharp angles of her jawline. Beside her walked Nicole Keller, carrying a newly drafted corporate charter. Before entering her office, Victoria stopped at the central trading floor. The senior executives and analysts who had witnessed Garrett Cross's public termination stood frozen at their desks. Effective immediately, Victoria's voice rang out across the room, clear and unyielding. Vance Strategic Holdings is restructuring its operational philosophy. We are no longer measuring human worth by a time card. I have permanently terminated the contracts of the executives who found amusement in an employee's torn uniform last Tuesday. In this firm, humanity will be our primary asset. She stepped into her private office and looked at the clean mahogany desk. On the center of the glass lay a newly minted security credential, bound in brushed steel and gold. It read, Chief of Global Infrastructure Protection and Security Operations. Beneath it was an employment agreement with 2 handwritten addendums. Absolute scheduling flexibility for parental obligations. Mandatory departure by 5 p.m. She had personally signed it. Garrett had accepted the position on Friday evening, not because of the massive executive salary increase, but because he knew the system needed a structural anchor to protect the people within it. Saturday arrived with a brilliant, biting clarity. The autumn air over Seattle was so crisp it felt sharp against the skin, the blue sky stretching endlessly over Puget Sound, throwing bright light across the concrete structures of the city. Beacon Crest Park sat on a high ridge overlooking the water, its grounds dominated by a massive, weathered wooden fortress structure near the south end, its handrails worn smooth by years of children's hands. On this particular morning, the park was quiet, the red and gold leaves of the maples drifting slowly onto the grass. Victoria arrived at exactly 9:28 a.m. Chloe walked beside her at a pace that was technically casual but actually quite urgent. The little girl wasn't wearing her Academy windbreaker today. She wore a bright yellow jacket, her eyes scanning the playground with a mixture of eagerness and absolute peace. The lingering shadows of the dark garage had been entirely erased by the quiet security of the past few days. Garrett and Maya were already there. Maya was 7, soon turning 8, with her father's dark eyes and a green winter coat. She was currently standing at the highest platform of the wooden fortress, holding a small notebook under her arm, surveying the terrain with the focused gravity of a general satisfied with the ground. Garrett stood below, one hand resting on the wooden railing, watching her. He was wearing a dark canvas jacket and heavy boots, his posture relaxed. The deep bruising along his jaw had faded to a light yellow at the edges, and the tension in his shoulders was entirely gone. When he turned and saw them coming across the lawn, his expression shifted. There was no defensive armor, no guarded military mask. It was simple, open warmth. The two girls didn't wait for the slow machinery of adult judgment. Children possessed an instinctive, beautiful shorthand for connection. Maya descended the wooden ladder 2 rungs at a time, landing on the grass with a light thud that didn't alarm Garrett at all. "I'm mapping the eastern perimeter," Maya announced, pointing her pencil toward the stone path. "Do you want to check the tire swing? I can push you really high." "Only if I get to push you after," Chloe replied, her face lighting up with an uncomplicated joy that Victoria hadn't seen in months. "Deal," Maya said. Without another word, the two girls sprinted toward the swing, their laughter echoing across the open grass like a melody that instantly dissolved the heavy corporate trauma of the past. Victoria and Garrett stood 20 feet apart before walking closer to stand beside each other, watching their daughters climb onto the massive tire swing together. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the soft rustle of the leaves and the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore. "How are the ribs?" Victoria asked softly, her eyes tracking the girls. "Fine. Better," Garrett said, a subtle, genuine smile touching the corners of his eyes. "The wrap comes off Monday. I start the new role then." Nicole already sent over the secondary network projections, and she seemed pleased that the security integration is running 6% above forecast. "She would be," Victoria said, looking back at him. The emotional distance between them had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet, powerful chemistry born of shared survival. Nicole is efficient, but mildly terrifying. "I noticed," he said quietly. "I think we'll get along well." Chloe was laughing now, the sound carrying across the ridge with absolute delight. Victoria watched them and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a long time, the first real crack in a structure she had spent years reinforcing, without examining whether she actually needed to be so strong. "She called you a hero," Victoria said softly, her voice dropping to a vulnerable register. Chloe, when she was describing what happened in the stairwell, she uses that word now because she means it. Garrett looked at the girls on the swing, his dark eyes carrying that profound, grounded stillness that had saved her family in the dark. "I just did what was in front of me," he said. "What needed doing." "I know," Victoria said, turning her gaze to him. "That's the whole thing, isn't it? Knowing what needs doing, and doing it without waiting to be acknowledged for it. I'm still learning that one." It was, for Victoria Vance, an unusual admission. She meant it anyway. Garrett looked at her, his expression entirely unhurried. Nothing performed about it. He looked back at his daughter, who had now opened her notebook again. "Maya," he called out. "What's the reconnaissance report?" Maya consulted her notebook with great seriousness. 2 seagulls on the pier, 1 medium dog, and the path behind the fortress is clear. "Conditions are good," she looked up, her gap-toothed smile bright. "Can Chloe stay for lunch after?" Garrett looked at Victoria, an unspoken invitation hanging in the quiet space between them. Victoria smiled, a real, radiant expression that reached all the way to her eyes. "I don't see why not," she said. The tire swing moved slowly in the cold, bright morning air. The city was still there across the water, vast and relentless. But here on the ridge, the world was small, ordinary, and completely safe. Victoria Vance stood beside the man who had rewritten her life, knowing she had finally found the one thing her money could never buy. She was here now.